Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, 40 miles from the nearest town, 16-year-old Marcus Chen stared at the thermometer reading -62 degrees Fahrenheit. The coldest winter on record was crushing everything in its path, killing wildlife and shutting down entire communities. But Marcus wasn't worried. Inside his bizarre underground shelter, part igloo, part bunker, part greenhouse, it was a comfortable 70 degrees. What the weather experts didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just some outdoor enthusiast playing survival games. He was the son of a legendary military engineer who disappeared 3 years ago, leaving behind only cryptic blueprints and a warning: when they come looking, you'll need to disappear completely. Marcus had spent those 3 years perfecting his father's designs, creating something that shouldn't exist, a shelter that could sustain life indefinitely in impossible conditions. Now, as search helicopters circled overhead and his past closed in, Marcus realized his father's paranoia might have saved his life. But what was his father really running from, and why did someone want them both dead? Marcus adjusted the small hydroponics system, humming quietly in the corner, where winter vegetables grew under LED panels powered by his geothermal energy tap. The shelter's design defied conventional wisdom. 3 interconnected chambers built into a natural hillside, reinforced with salvaged steel and insulated with an ingenious combination of snow, earth, and recycled materials. Most engineers would call it impossible. Marcus called it home. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades grew louder overhead. He'd been tracking their search pattern for 2 days, watching through the carefully camouflaged periscope his father had taught him to build. They weren't park rangers or rescue teams. Their equipment was too advanced, their flight patterns too systematic. These were the people his father had warned him about. Marcus moved to his communications station, a jury-rigged setup that could monitor emergency frequencies without transmitting his location. The static crackled with urgent voices. Sector 7 complete. No visual contact. Subject remains at large. Subject, not person, not missing teenager. The words sent ice through his veins, colder than the brutal wind howling above ground. He'd been 12 when everything changed. His father, Colonel David Chen, had come home from another classified assignment, different. Paranoid, always looking over his shoulder, sketching mysterious blueprints late into the night. Within 6 months, they'd moved from their comfortable military housing to an isolated cabin in Alaska. His father claimed it was for advanced wilderness training, but Marcus had seen the fear in his eyes. The blueprints were his father's legacy, detailed schematics for survival structures that seemed to anticipate every possible threat, not just weather, but electromagnetic pulses, chemical attacks, and prolonged siege conditions. Marcus had thought his father was losing his mind until the night 3 men in tactical gear surrounded their cabin. His father had shoved a backpack into his hands and pointed toward the hidden exit tunnel. "Remember what I taught you," he'd whispered urgently. "Build the shelter, trust no one. They'll make it look like we're the criminals, but we're not. We just know too much." That was the last time Marcus saw him alive. For 3 years, he'd lived off the grid, moving between temporary shelters while perfecting his father's designs. He'd learned to hunt, fish, and forage. He'd studied engineering texts by candlelight and practiced building techniques until his hands bled. When this brutal winter arrived, he'd finally felt confident enough to construct the ultimate shelter, the one from his father's most complex blueprints. The helicopter noise faded, but Marcus knew they'd be back. They always came back. He pulled out his father's journal, pages worn from constant reading. One entry haunted him. Project Cold Spring wasn't supposed to exist. Weather modification technology in the wrong hands could destabilize entire regions. "I tried to bury it, but Harrison thinks I kept copies. Maybe I should have. Maybe the world needs to know what they're planning." Weather modification. Marcus looked at his thermometer again, at the impossible cold that had shattered every record. Was this natural, or was someone testing his father's stolen research on an unsuspecting world? A new sound cut through the wind, snowmobiles approaching from the east. Marcus quickly sealed his journal in its waterproof case and moved to the emergency exit tunnel. If they'd found his main entrance, he had maybe minutes before they breached his defenses. But something made him pause. Through the periscope, he spotted movement that didn't match the search patterns he'd been tracking. A lone figure on skis, struggling through the blizzard, moving with the desperation of someone fleeing rather than hunting. Marcus watched as the figure collapsed just 50 yards from his hidden entrance. The smart move was to wait, to let whoever it was disappear beneath the snow rather than risk exposure. But as the wind shifted, he caught sight of a familiar face through his scope. Sarah Martinez, his childhood friend from the military base, someone he'd thought was lost forever when his world collapsed. She was unconscious and dying in the snow, and she was definitely running from the same people hunting him. The shelter's walls hummed with an almost imperceptible vibration as Marcus ran his calloused fingers along the curved interior surface. Most people would have dismissed it as settling wood, but Marcus knew better. The sound meant the structure was alive, responding to the changing atmospheric pressure outside like a living organism adapting to its environment. 3 weeks had passed since he'd completed the impossible build, and the local weather station was already reporting record-breaking temperature drops for early November. The meteorologists on his solar-powered radio spoke in increasingly urgent tones about a polar vortex descending from the Arctic, bringing with it the kind of cold that killed unprepared souls in their sleep. Marcus pulled his worn journal from beneath his sleeping mat and flipped to the page where he'd sketched the shelter's design. The drawing looked deceptively simple, a dome-like structure that appeared to defy the basic principles of thermal dynamics. What the sketch couldn't capture was the intricate network of air channels he'd carved into the walls, creating a circulation system that would trap and redistribute body heat with mechanical precision. He'd learned the technique from an Inuit elder named Kaya during his 2 years in the Yukon Territory. Those had been good years, before the phone calls started coming and before he'd realized that even the remotest corners of Canada weren't remote enough. Kaya had shown him how their ancestors survived temperatures that would kill modern humans in minutes, not through superior technology, but through understanding the subtle mathematics of survival. A sharp crack echoed from outside, followed by the distinctive groan of a tree succumbing to ice. Marcus set down his journal and crawled to the shelter's observation port, a clever design feature that appeared to be nothing more than a natural gap in the wood, but actually provided a clear view of the surrounding forest while remaining invisible from outside. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since sunset. Frost was already forming intricate patterns on the nearby pine needles, and the ground looked brittle enough to shatter under a footstep. This was just the beginning. According to his calculations, they had maybe 48 hours before the real cold arrived, the kind that would turn exposed skin black in minutes and freeze lungs with each breath. Marcus had survived worse, but never in one place for so long. His usual strategy involved staying mobile, never settling anywhere long enough for patterns to emerge or for certain people to triangulate his position. But something about this place felt different. The forest had welcomed him in a way that reminded him of his childhood, before everything went wrong, before his father's research had attracted the wrong kind of attention. He pushed the memory away and focused on the immediate concerns. His food stores were adequate for 6 weeks if rationed properly, and the natural spring he'd discovered 200 yards north would provide water as long as he could keep the access point from freezing solid. The real challenge would be maintaining the shelter's heating system without creating enough smoke to advertise his location. Marcus had solved this problem with characteristic ingenuity, designing a combustion chamber that burned so efficiently it produced almost no visible smoke. The system drew air through underground channels that preheated the oxygen while exhausting waste gases through a network of hollow logs that dispersed the minimal smoke across a wide area. To any casual observer, including thermal imaging equipment, it would appear as natural ground heat. A distant sound made him freeze. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but Marcus had spent years training his ears to detect the unnatural among nature's symphony. This sound was wrong, too regular, too mechanical. He slipped into his winter gear with practiced silence and eased out of the shelter through the concealed entrance. The cold hit him like a physical force, but his body had long ago learned to adapt quickly to temperature changes. Moving with the fluid grace that had kept him alive for 3 years, Marcus worked his way through the forest toward the sound's source. 20 minutes later, he lay prone on a ridge overlooking the old logging road that wound through the valley below. His breath formed minimal clouds in the frigid air as he watched a black SUV navigate the treacherous path, its headlights cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. The vehicle stopped approximately half a mile from his shelter's location. 2 figures emerged, their movements professional and coordinated. Even at this distance, Marcus could see the telltale bulges of concealed weapons and the way they communicated through hand signals rather than voices that might carry in the still air. They weren't lost hunters or park rangers checking on winter campers. These were the people he'd been running from, the ones who'd never stopped looking for Dr. Harrison Blake's son, the ones who believed that Marcus possessed something his father had hidden before his death. Marcus watched them deploy what looked like scanning equipment, and his jaw tightened. They were getting better, more systematic. The random searches of previous years had evolved into something methodical and terrifyingly efficient. The impossible shelter wasn't just his protection against the coming storm anymore. It was his only hope of staying hidden long enough to survive both the Arctic blast and the human predators who'd finally tracked him to his refuge. The thermal imaging drone had been circling for 3 days now, making lazy figure eights over the forest canopy. Most people would have missed it entirely, a dark speck against the grey winter sky, silent as a hunting hawk. But Kai wasn't most people. He'd learned to spot surveillance equipment the way other kids learned to identify birds. He pressed himself deeper into the snow-covered pine bough that served as his observation post, watching the drone through a makeshift periscope fashioned from mirror shards and PVC pipe. His breath formed small puffs in the frigid air, each exhale carefully controlled to avoid creating a visible vapor trail. The drone's search pattern was methodical, professional, government issue most likely, which meant Marcus had finally decided to escalate beyond the usual street-level muscle. Kai's jaw tightened as he remembered his foster father's cold smile, the way the man's fingers always drummed against his desk when he was planning something particularly vicious. 3 years. He'd managed to stay hidden for 3 years, moving from town to town, always keeping to the margins. He'd been careful. No social media, no permanent addresses, always paying in cash. But somehow they'd found him anyway. The drone completed another pass and banked eastward, its camera array sweeping across the forest below. Kai remained motionless until the aircraft disappeared beyond the tree line, then slithered backward through the snow until he was safely concealed behind a cluster of granite boulders. His shelter lay another quarter-mile deeper into the woods, completely invisible from above thanks to the living roof of interwoven branches he'd spent weeks cultivating. But invisibility wouldn't be enough now. If they'd found his general location, it was only a matter of time before they brought in ground teams. The weather radio in his backpack crackled to life as he hiked back through the underbrush, historic low-pressure system moving in from the northwest. Temperatures expected to plummet to -35 degrees Fahrenheit by Thursday night. This will be the coldest weather on record for our region. Authorities are advising all residents to... Kai switched off the radio and quickened his pace. 2 problems, both potentially fatal. The kind of cold they were predicting would kill an unprepared person within hours, but it might also provide the cover he needed. Marcus's people were dangerous, but they weren't wilderness experts. They'd hunker down in heated hotels and wait for the storm to pass. The shelter's entrance was hidden beneath what appeared to be a natural deadfall of branches and snow. Kai crawled through the narrow tunnel, sealing the opening behind him with a custom-made plug lined with pine boughs. The temperature rose immediately as he moved deeper into the structure's heart. What he'd built defied conventional wisdom about wilderness shelters. Most survival guides preached simplicity, lean-tos, debris huts, basic structures designed to keep wind and precipitation at bay. Kai's creation was something else entirely, a complex warren of interconnected chambers carved into a hillside, with multiple levels connected by carefully angled tunnels that trapped warm air while allowing for ventilation. The main living space was surprisingly spacious, its walls lined with a mixture of clay, pine needles, and shredded bark that provided excellent insulation. A small fire burned in a specially designed hearth that channeled smoke through a hidden flue system, dispersing it through multiple exit points to avoid detection. Shelves carved directly into the earthen walls held his supplies: dried fish and game meat, foraged nuts and berries, medical supplies salvaged from abandoned cabins. But the shelter's most remarkable feature was its heating system, a network of hollow branches and bamboo tubes that circulated warm air throughout the structure, using nothing but convection and careful engineering. He'd studied traditional Korean ondol heating systems in library books, adapting the ancient technology for his modern needs. Kai settled onto a bed made from pine boughs and salvaged sleeping bags, pulling out a worn notebook filled with sketches and calculations. He'd been planning for this day ever since he'd arrived in these woods, knowing that eventually his past would catch up with him. The question wasn't whether Marcus would find him, but when. He flipped to a page covered with detailed maps of the surrounding wilderness, marking escape routes and supply caches he'd established over the past months. The coming storm would make travel nearly impossible, but it would also create opportunities. Search teams couldn't operate effectively in whiteout conditions, and thermal imaging became less reliable when everything was frozen. His fingers traced one particular route leading north toward the Canadian border, 50 miles of brutal terrain that would test even his considerable skills. But if he could reach the old logging roads beyond the ridge, he might be able to disappear again. Find another small town, another identity, another chance to stay ahead of the ghosts that haunted him. Outside, wind began to howl through the trees as the first bands of the historic storm system moved in. Kai closed the notebook and fed another piece of seasoned wood to the fire, watching sparks dance up the hidden chimney. The real test was just beginning. The snow began falling at dawn, fat flakes that stuck to everything they touched. Marcus watched from inside his shelter, pressing his palm against the translucent ice window he'd carved from a frozen puddle. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees overnight, and the radio's static-filled weather reports spoke of record-breaking cold moving in from the north. He'd been awake since 4, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest held a different quality of silence now, not the peaceful quiet of winter settling in, but the tense hush that came before something terrible happened. His body remembered that silence from years of running, years of looking over his shoulder. The coffee was bitter, made from grounds he'd stretched too thin, but the warmth was welcome. As he sipped it, Marcus mentally inventoried his supplies again. Food for maybe 3 weeks if he was careful, firewood for longer. Thanks to the shelter's efficient design, water wasn't a problem with the snow, and his filtration system could handle anything the nearby stream offered. But supplies wouldn't matter if they found him. Marcus pulled out a worn photograph from his jacket pocket, its edges soft from handling. A woman with kind eyes smiled back at him, her arm around a much younger version of himself. Sarah Chen had been more than his handler. She'd been the closest thing to a mother he'd ever known. The day she died, bleeding out in a Montreal safe house while he held pressure on her wounds, she'd made him promise to disappear completely. "Trust no one from the program," she'd whispered, her voice growing weaker. "Not even the ones who seem like friends. They'll use you until there's nothing left." A branch snapped somewhere in the distance. Marcus froze, the photograph halfway back to his pocket. He counted the seconds, listening. Another snap, then the soft crunch of footsteps in snow. Moving carefully, Marcus sealed the photograph in a waterproof pouch and tucked it away. He pulled on his boots and grabbed the knife from his belt, easing toward the shelter's entrance. The footsteps were getting closer, too heavy for a deer, too deliberate for a casual hiker. Through a gap in the entrance covering, Marcus caught a flash of movement between the trees. A figure in winter camouflage, moving with military precision. His blood turned to ice water. They'd found him. The operative was alone, at least for now. Marcus recognized the search pattern, a systematic sweep designed to flush out a target without alerting them. He'd been taught the same technique 3 years ago, back when he thought the people training him were the good guys. Marcus had two choices: run or fight. Running meant abandoning the shelter and heading into the storm with minimal supplies. Fighting meant potentially killing someone who was just following orders, someone who might not even know the full truth about what the program had become. The decision was made for him when the operative spotted the shelter. Marcus watched the man's posture change, saw him reach for the radio clipped to his vest. In seconds, this location would be compromised and backup would be on the way. Marcus moved without thinking, muscle memory taking over. He slipped out the back exit he'd built into the shelter's design, circling wide through the trees. The snow muffled his footsteps, and his white winter gear helped him blend with the landscape. The operative was focused on the shelter's main entrance, speaking quietly into his radio. "Base, this is Tracker 2. I've got something. Looks like a shelter, definitely not standard survival construction. Architecture is unusual. Requesting immediate backup to my location." The voice was young, nervous. This wasn't one of the program's veteran assets, probably a new recruit who didn't know he was hunting a 16-year-old kid who'd been turned into a weapon. Marcus was close enough now to see the man's face through his scope, barely older than Marcus himself, with the kind of eager determination that suggested he believed he was doing important work. The radio crackled with a response. "Copy. Tracker 2. Backup is 15 minutes out. Do not approach until support arrives. Target is considered extremely dangerous." Extremely dangerous. Marcus almost laughed at the bitter irony. They'd made him dangerous, then acted surprised when he used those skills to survive. The operative settled in to wait, finding cover behind a fallen log with good sightlines on the shelter. He was professional enough, but Marcus could see the flaws in his position. The way his breath steamed gave away his location, and he favored his right side, suggesting an old injury that affected his mobility. 15 minutes. Marcus could disable him in 30 seconds and be gone before backup arrived, but that would confirm his location and bring even more heat down on him. Or he could wait, let them search the shelter, maybe convince them he'd moved on. The snow was falling harder now, and Marcus felt the temperature dropping even through his insulated gear. The storm was getting worse, which meant staying hidden was becoming a matter of life and death. Either way, his time in paradise was over. The storm hit 3 days ahead of schedule, transforming the forest into a howling white nightmare that would have killed most people within hours. Marcus watched from inside his shelter as wind speeds climbed past 60 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally through the trees like frozen bullets. The temperature gauge he'd mounted near the entrance read -37 degrees Fahrenheit, and still dropping. But inside his impossible creation, the air remained a comfortable 68 degrees. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the reinforced observation window, her breath fogging the glass despite the insulation. She'd been studying survival architecture for 15 years, had written papers on thermal dynamics in extreme environments, and nothing she knew could explain how this structure functioned. The boy had used materials any hiker might carry, tarps, rope, basic tools, yet somehow engineered a microclimate that defied the laws of physics. "The heat signature makes no sense," she muttered, checking her instruments again. "There's no external heat source, no fuel burning, nothing. The energy has to be coming from somewhere." Marcus glanced up from where he sat cross-legged on the floor, methodically sharpening his knife. "Maybe your instruments are broken." "These instruments cost more than most people's cars. They're not broken." Chen moved to another panel, running diagnostics. The thermal imaging shows heat distribution patterns that shouldn't be possible with passive design alone. You've created some kind of closed-loop system that's actually generating energy rather than just conserving it. "If you say so." Marcus tested the blade against his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. He watched it bead and fall, remembering another time he'd bled in the snow. Snow, different mountains, but the same desperate need to disappear. Outside, a massive pine crashed somewhere in the darkness, the impact shuddering through the ground. Chen flinched, but Marcus didn't react. He'd been listening to the storm's progression for hours, cataloguing the sounds of destruction. In the morning, assuming they survived, the forest would be transformed into an obstacle course of fallen timber and snowdrifts 20 feet deep. "You're not just some survivalist kid, are you?" Chen said suddenly. Marcus stopped sharpening the knife. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I've met plenty of wilderness enthusiasts. Hell, I've trained with military engineers and Arctic specialists. None of them could build what you've built. This isn't hobby-level knowledge. This is something else entirely." The wind screamed past the shelter, but the walls held steady. Marcus had anchored the structure using principles he'd learned in places where failure meant more than discomfort, where the wrong choice led to consequences that echoed through generations. "Sometimes people learn fast when they have to," he said finally. Chen studied his face in the dim light. "How old are you really?" 16. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Marcus set down the knife and met her gaze. For a moment, she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something older and harder than any teenager should carry. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful mask he wore like armor. "I'm exactly who I told you I was. A kid who likes camping and got caught in a storm." Kids who like camping don't engineer thermal dynamics that shouldn't exist. They don't calculate load-bearing requirements for winds that would flatten most buildings. They don't— Sharp crack interrupted her words, followed by a sound like tearing fabric. Both of them froze, listening. The noise came again, closer this time, and Marcus was on his feet instantly, moving toward the entrance with fluid precision. "What is it?" Chen whispered. "Tree fall. Big one." Marcus pulled on his jacket and grabbed a headlamp. "Sounds like it might have clipped the northeast anchor point." "You're not going out there. It's a death sentence. If that anchor fails, this whole structure could collapse. Then we're both dead." He checked his gear methodically. Knife, rope, emergency beacon, tools of survival he'd carried across 3 continents, though Chen didn't know that. "At least let me monitor from here. Keep radio contact." Marcus paused at the entrance flap, looking back at her. In that moment, Chen realized she was seeing him clearly for the first time, not the careful performance he projected, but the person underneath. Someone who calculated risks with the cold precision of a professional, someone who'd faced death before and made the calculations necessary to survive. "If something happens to me, there's an emergency cache buried 50 meters due south. GPS coordinates are taped under the temperature gauge. Food, water, and a satellite beacon that'll bring help within 12 hours. "Marcus!" But he was already gone, swallowed by the storm. Chen pressed against the window, watching his headlamp disappear into the swirling white chaos. The structure creaked around her, still impossibly warm despite the violence outside. She began to understand that surviving the storm might be the least of their problems. The storm hit 3 hours before dawn, turning the world into a screaming white void. Jake woke to the sound of wind that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, a howling that made his bones ache. But inside the shelter, wrapped in the strange geometry of his impossible creation, the temperature held steady at a comfortable 68 degrees. He'd been dreaming of Marcus again, the same nightmare that had plagued him for months. His older brother's face in the headlights, the screech of brakes, the terrible silence that followed. But this time, something was different. In the dream, Marcus had been trying to warn him about something. The words were lost in the wind, but the urgency in his brother's eyes was unmistakable. Jake sat up, his breath visible in small puffs despite the shelter's warmth. Something felt wrong. Not with the structure. He could sense its stability like a sixth sense, every joint and beam singing in harmony against the storm's assault. No, this was something else, something that made the hair on his neck stand up. Through the small observation window he'd built into the eastern wall, He could see nothing but swirling white. The storm was massive, a late-season blizzard that the Weather Service was calling unprecedented. Temperatures were dropping toward -40, with wind chills that could kill exposed skin in minutes, the kind of storm that would shut down entire cities and leave emergency crews helpless. Perfect cover for someone who didn't want to be seen. Jake moved to his equipment cache, pulling out the small radio he'd modified to monitor emergency frequencies. Static filled the air, punctuated by fragments of desperate transmissions. Search and rescue teams grounded. Highway patrol reporting multiple vehicle accidents, power lines down across 3 counties. Then he heard something that made his blood freeze. Requesting immediate backup at the Clearwater trailhead. We have confirmation of the target's last known location. Vehicle abandoned, tracks leading north into the wilderness area. The transmission cut to static, but Jake had heard enough. They'd found his truck. The same truck he'd abandoned deliberately 5 miles from here, hoping to buy himself more time, but not nearly enough time. He began moving with practiced efficiency, packing only the essentials. Food for 3 days, water purification tablets, the modified radio, and most importantly, the drive containing everything he'd downloaded from his father's computer, the evidence that had started this whole nightmare. The wind outside reached a new crescendo, and Jake felt a momentary pang at leaving his creation. The shelter represented months of planning and building, a masterpiece of engineering that had already saved his life, but it was also a trap now. They would find it eventually, and when they did, he needed to be long gone. As he prepared to leave, Jake's mind drifted back to the conversation that had changed everything. 3 months ago, sitting in Dr. Elizabeth Shaw's office, listening to her explain why his father's research had to be stopped. The weapons contract, the potential for mass destruction, the fact that his own father was willing to sell technology that could level city blocks to the highest bidder. "You're the only one who can access his files," she had said, her green eyes intense behind wire-rimmed glasses. "The biometric locks, the encryption, it's all keyed to family members. You and Marcus were the fail-safes." But Marcus was gone, killed in what everyone believed was an accident, but Jake now suspected was something far more sinister. That left only him, a 16-year-old who'd rather spend his time in the woods than in a laboratory. The radio crackled again. This time the transmission was clearer, and Jake's heart nearly stopped. "Storm or no storm, we move at 0600. The boy can't have gotten far on foot, and thermal imaging shows structure signatures in Grid 7, possible shelter construction." Jake checked his watch. 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes. He slung his pack over his shoulders and moved toward the shelter's rear exit, a carefully concealed hatch that opened into a natural depression behind a cluster of boulders. The wind hit him like a physical blow as he emerged, driving snow into his face with the force of tiny needles. Visibility was less than 10 feet, but Jake had memorized every tree, every rock formation within a mile radius. Behind him, his impossible shelter sat silent and strong, its revolutionary design allowing it to stand firm against winds that were toppling century-old trees. In a few hours, when the storm passed, it would likely become famous. Engineers would study its construction, marveling at how a teenager had managed to create something so innovative. But Jake wouldn't be there to see it. He pulled his hood tight and struck out into the howling wilderness, following a route he'd mapped weeks ago for exactly this scenario. The safe house was 12 miles northeast, hidden in a canyon that would mask his heat signature. If he could reach it before the storm cleared, he might have a chance. The wind swallowed his footprints within seconds, erasing all trace of his passage. The storm had been building for 3 days, and Marcus could feel it in his bones, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep through the earth itself. The weather radio crackled with urgent warnings about the historic blizzard approaching, but he'd stopped listening after the 3rd evacuation notice. There was nowhere to run that they couldn't find him. He pressed his eye to the periscope he'd fashioned from salvaged mirrors and surveyed the white wasteland above. Snow already fell in thick, diagonal sheets, accumulating faster than he'd anticipated. The entrance to his underground shelter was nearly invisible now, camouflaged beneath a carefully constructed drift that looked entirely natural. Perfect. Inside his impossible creation, warm air circulated through a network of channels he'd carved into the frozen earth, heated by a geothermal system that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The walls, lined with a mixture of mud, grass, and salvaged insulation, maintained a steady temperature that defied every principle of conventional shelter design. He'd learned these techniques from his grandfather, methods passed down through generations of people who knew how to disappear when they needed to. The radio suddenly erupted with static, then cleared to reveal a news bulletin that made his blood freeze colder than the wind above. Federal manhunt continues for Marcus Chen, 16, wanted in connection with the incident in Seattle. The suspect is considered extremely dangerous and should not be approached. Authorities believe he may be hiding in the wilderness areas of... Marcus switched off the radio with trembling fingers. They'd found his trail faster than expected. The careful months of preparation, the meticulous construction of his shelter, the false identities he'd created. None of it had bought him as much time as he'd hoped. A metallic ping echoed through the shelter's ventilation system, followed by another. Ice pellets, striking the concealed air intake with increasing frequency. The real storm was beginning, and with it came both salvation and terrible danger. The blizzard would cover his tracks, make him impossible to find, but it would also trap him underground for days, maybe weeks. He checked his supplies methodically, the way his grandfather had taught him. Water, sufficient, thanks to the snow he could melt and the condensation system. Food, enough freeze-dried meals and preserved meat to last 3 weeks if he rationed carefully. Fuel, the geothermal system would run indefinitely, but his backup propane heaters had maybe 10 days of burn time. The shelter groaned softly around him as the weight of accumulating snow pressed down from above. Most people would have panicked at the sound, but Marcus found it oddly comforting. The earth was embracing his creation, accepting it as part of the natural landscape. By morning, there would be no trace of human habitation visible from the surface. He pulled out a worn photograph, the edges soft from handling. His grandfather stood beside a similar shelter in the mountains of Tibet, young and strong, his eyes holding secrets that Marcus was only beginning to understand. The old man had taught him more than survival techniques. He'd taught him how to become invisible, how to think like the hunted, how to turn the wilderness itself into an ally. A new sound penetrated the shelter's walls, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors, barely audible above the wind. Marcus froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, circling, searching. They were out there in the storm, using thermal imaging and ground-penetrating radar, trying to locate any sign of artificial heat or human presence. But his shelter was a ghost in their instruments. The geothermal heating masked his body temperature, and the construction materials he'd chosen absorbed and deflected scanning attempts. His grandfather's old stories about hiding from Chinese patrols in mountain caves had provided more than inspiration. They'd provided a blueprint for invisibility. The helicopter noise faded as the aircraft moved on, defeated by the worsening conditions. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Nature was his protector now, wrapping him in a cocoon of ice and wind that no technology could penetrate. He settled back against the curved wall of his sanctuary and opened one of his grandfather's journals, reading by the light of a small LED lamp. The pages were filled with diagrams and notes about underground construction, emergency protocols, and most importantly, the philosophy of survival. The earth provides for those who understand her secrets. Become part of the landscape, and you become invisible to your enemies. Outside, the storm intensified to a howling fury that would make headlines across the region. Record-breaking snowfall, unprecedented wind speeds, temperatures that could kill an exposed human in minutes. Emergency services would suspend all operations until it passed. But inside his impossible shelter, Marcus was warm and safe and hidden. The 16-year-old who had vanished into the wilderness was gone, swallowed by winter itself. When the storm finally ended, only the earth would remember where he was buried. The storm hit with the fury of a living thing, transforming the world outside into a swirling nightmare of white. Marcus pressed his face against the reinforced window he'd built into the shelter's south wall, watching trees bend at impossible angles before disappearing entirely into the maelstrom. The wind howled like something wounded and angry, and he could feel the entire structure trembling around him. But it held. The shelter's curved walls deflected the worst of the wind's assault, just as he'd calculated. The geothermal heating system he'd jury-rigged from salvaged parts kept the interior at a steady 68 degrees, while outside the temperature had plummeted to -47. According to his radio, it was the worst blizzard to hit the region in over a century. Perfect timing, he thought grimly, just when Victor's people had finally tracked him down. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts. Roads were impassable. Power lines were down across 3 counties. Search and rescue operations had been suspended indefinitely. The announcer's voice carried barely concealed panic as he read off a growing list of fatalities, people caught unprepared when the storm struck with unprecedented speed. Marcus adjusted the small antenna he'd run through the shelter's wall, trying to pick up clearer signals. Between the weather reports, he caught fragments of other communications, police bands, emergency services, and something else that made his blood run cold, encrypted burst transmissions on frequencies he recognized from his father's work. They were still out there, still looking. He moved to his equipment cache and pulled out a modified scanner his father had built years ago, one capable of breaking through basic encryption. His hands shook slightly as he powered it up, not from cold, but from the memories it brought flooding back. His father teaching him how frequency hopping worked, how to identify different agency protocols, how to disappear when the people you trusted most proved they couldn't be trusted at all. The scanner locked onto a signal, and Viktor Kozlov's voice filled the shelter with its familiar Russian accent. Weather is providing excellent cover. Local authorities are paralyzed. We proceed as planned. Another voice responded, younger, probably American. The storm's got everything locked down tight. No one's moving in or out of the search grid. Good. The boy cannot have gone far. His shelter is somewhere in this area. We know this from the thermal satellite imagery before the storm hit. When weather clears, we triangulate on any heat signatures. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Thermal imaging. He'd been so focused on visual camouflage and structural integrity that he hadn't considered his heat signature from above. The shelter's efficiency might actually work against him. A warm structure in a field of snow would show up like a beacon to the right equipment. He quickly shut down all non-essential systems, reducing the shelter's thermal output. The temperature inside began to drop almost immediately. He could survive at 40 degrees for a while, especially with his cold weather gear. But if the storm lasted more than a day or two, he'd have to choose between freezing and revealing his position. Outside, the wind seemed to grow even more violent. Something heavy crashed against the shelter's exterior, probably a tree branch or debris, but the structure absorbed the impact without damage. His father would have been proud of the engineering, Marcus thought. Too bad he'd never see it. The thought brought an unexpected surge of grief. 3 years since his father's death, and it still hit him like a physical blow sometimes. Dr. Richard Chen had been brilliant, paranoid, and ultimately right about everything that mattered. The people he'd worked with, the projects they'd forced him to complete, the danger they'd all be in if he ever tried to walk away. Marcus had been 13 when they'd killed his father and made it look like an accident. Old enough to understand what the encrypted files on his father's hidden drive really meant. Smart enough to disappear before they came for him too. Young enough to believe he could stay hidden forever. The scanner crackled again. Boss, we're getting reports of a structure in Quadrant 7. Locals are calling it impossible. Some kind of advanced shelter built by a kid. Too sophisticated for normal camping gear. Victor's voice turned sharp. Coordinates. Marcus felt his world tilt. They knew, maybe not exactly where, but they knew what to look for. His impossible shelter had become a signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. He began moving with practiced efficiency, packing only the most essential items into a waterproof bag. Food for 3 days. emergency medical supplies. The portable drive containing his father's files, the ones that could bring down half of Victor's operation if they ever reached the right people, and the gun he'd hoped never to use, a compact pistol his father had taught him to shoot when he was barely tall enough to hold it steady. The storm was his enemy and his salvation. It would hide his escape, but it could also kill him in minutes if he made the wrong choice. Outside, the temperature was approaching 50 below with wind chill. Hypothermia would set in fast, even with his gear. But staying meant capture, and capture meant death, or worse, becoming the asset Victor needed to complete his father's work. Marcus shouldered his pack and moved toward the shelter's concealed rear exit. The storm hit harder than Marcus had predicted. Through the reinforced viewing port he'd carved into the shelter's wall, he watched the world disappear behind a curtain of white. The wind howled like something alive and angry, testing every joint and seal of his creation. Ice crystals peppered the transparent barrier with machine gun intensity. Inside, the temperature held steady at 68 degrees. The geothermal system hummed quietly beneath the floor, drawing heat from the Earth's core through his carefully engineered network of pipes and heat exchangers. Most people thought geothermal only worked in places like Iceland or Yellowstone, but Marcus knew better. Dig deep enough anywhere, and the Earth would share its warmth. He checked the monitoring station he'd built into the eastern wall, a collection of salvaged electronics and handmade sensors that tracked everything from internal air quality to external wind speed. The storm was registering winds of 85 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 100. The temperature had dropped to negative 37 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was still falling. Through the howling wind, he heard something else. Something that made his blood freeze in ways the storm never could. Footsteps. Marcus killed all the interior lights and pressed his face to the viewing port. The storm made visibility nearly impossible, but there, dark shapes moving against the white. 2 figures, maybe 3, struggling through the blizzard with the determined gait of people who knew exactly where they were going. His heart hammered against his ribs. They'd found him. Moving with practiced silence, Marcus activated the shelter's lockdown protocol. Steel reinforcement bars slid into place behind the door. The ventilation system switched to internal circulation. Emergency power kicked in, shutting down anything that might emit a signal or sound. The figures drew closer, their shapes becoming clearer through the driving snow. 3 men in heavy winter gear, carrying equipment that definitely wasn't standard camping supplies. Marcus recognized the purposeful way they moved, the tactical formation they maintained even in the storm. Military training just like his father, just like the men who'd killed his father. One of them stopped directly above the shelter. Marcus held his breath, knowing that only the slightest depression in the snow marked the entrance to his underground sanctuary. He'd designed it that way, camouflaged to be invisible even to trained eyes. But these weren't ordinary searchers. The man above pulled out what looked like a metal detector, sweeping it in slow arcs across the snow. Marcus cursed silently. They had equipment specifically designed to find him. The shelter's metal components would show up like a beacon on the right scanner. The device in the man's hands began to chirp. Marcus moved to his emergency station, fingers flying over controls he'd hoped never to use. His father had taught him that any shelter worth building needed 3 things: a way in, a way out, and a way to disappear completely. The first 2 were obvious. The third required careful planning and significant sacrifice. Above him, he heard voices shouting over the wind, tools being unpacked, the methodical scraping of snow being cleared away from his carefully concealed entrance. Marcus made his choice. He pulled the red lever marked with radiation warnings and felt the shelter shudder as explosive charges detonated in carefully calculated sequences. To anyone above, it would look like a catastrophic structural failure, the kind of accident that could happen to any amateur builder foolish enough to dig too deep in unstable soil. The entrance passage collapsed completely, sealing him inside while simultaneously opening his escape route. The emergency tunnel, barely wide enough for his shoulders, extended 40 feet through solid earth before emerging inside a carefully prepared cache point. Marcus had spent weeks digging it by hand, removing the soil one bucket at a time and scattering it across the forest. Nobody knew about the tunnel. Nobody except his father, and his father was dead. Marcus grabbed his go-bag and entered the tunnel as his beautiful, impossible shelter began its programmed self-destruction above him. The geothermal system would overload, creating a small but convincing explosion. The remaining structure would collapse in on itself, leaving only debris and disappointment for anyone who came looking. The tunnel was nightmare-tight and pitch black, but Marcus had crawled through it dozens of times in preparation for exactly this moment. He emerged 20 minutes later inside what appeared to be a fallen log, but was actually a carefully constructed hide that opened to reveal his secondary cache. Emergency supplies, winter gear, and most importantly, the encrypted hard drive his father had died protecting. The drive that contained enough information to topple governments and destroy criminal empires. The drive that made Marcus more valuable dead than alive to some very dangerous people. Behind him, muffled by earth and storm, he heard the rumble of his shelter's final destruction. 16 months of planning and building gone in minutes. But he was alive, and he still had the drive. Marcus pulled on his winter gear and checked his compass. The storm provided perfect cover, but it was also deadly. He had maybe 6 hours before hypothermia became a serious risk, even with proper equipment. 6 hours to disappear completely before his enemies realized they'd been chasing a ghost. The storm hit with a vengeance that made the previous blizzards look like gentle snow flurries. Marcus pressed himself against the shelter's inner wall, feeling the entire structure shudder as hurricane-force winds hammered against the exterior. The sound was deafening, like standing inside a freight train while it derailed. Sarah huddled beside him, her face pale in the flickering light of their small oil lamp. "How long can it hold?" she shouted over the roar. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was listening to the shelter's rhythm, the way a sailor might read the creaks of a ship's hull. The interlocking timber framework groaned but held firm, the stress distributed exactly as he'd calculated. The underground chambers they'd carved into the hillside provided additional stability, while the aerodynamic shape he'd designed forced the wind up and over rather than creating destructive pressure pockets. "It'll hold," he said finally, though his knuckles were white where he gripped the makeshift bench they sat on. 3 days into the storm, their radio crackled with emergency broadcasts. The blizzard had broken records across the entire region. Temperatures had dropped to -47 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills approaching -70. Highways were completely impassable. Power grids had failed across multiple states. Search and rescue operations had been suspended indefinitely. "Dozens of people are missing," the emergency coordinator's voice reported through heavy static. "We're asking everyone to shelter in place until conditions improve. Do not attempt to travel under any circumstances." Marcus switched off the radio to conserve battery power. In the sudden quiet, broken only by the wind's constant howl, Sarah studied his face. "You're thinking about Dr. Chen, aren't you?" He nodded. The old man was out there somewhere, hopefully safe in his cabin. But Marcus knew how quickly things could go wrong in conditions like this. A failed heating system, a collapsed roof, a simple injury. Any of these could turn deadly when rescue wasn't possible. "And you're thinking about the others too," Sarah continued. "The missing people." Marcus stood and moved to one of the shelter's observation ports, narrow slits he'd positioned to provide exterior visibility while maintaining structural integrity. Outside was a wall of white so thick he couldn't see more than a few feet. The wind had sculpted the snow into bizarre formations that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. "There's nothing we can do," he said, but the words felt like lead in his mouth. "Isn't there?" He turned to find Sarah watching him with an expression he recognized. It was the same look she'd worn when she'd first suggested they work together, when she'd pushed him to trust her with his secrets. Determination mixed with just enough recklessness to be dangerous. "The shelter's designed to be temporary," Marcus said slowly, understanding where her thoughts were heading. The modular components could be reconfigured. Into what? Marcus moved to his notebook, sketching quickly. His pencil flew across the page as calculations poured from his mind onto paper. A mobile unit, smaller but capable of sustaining 2 people for maybe 6 hours in these conditions, long enough to reach someone and bring them back, like a rescue pod. "It's insane," he said, even as his hands continued designing. "The risks are enormous. If we miscalculate the structural loads, if the wind patterns shift, if we get lost, if we don't try, people die." The weight of her words settled between them. Marcus had spent years running from responsibility, from connections that might hurt him, but here, in this moment, isolation felt less like safety and more like cowardice. A new sound cut through the wind's roar, the sharp crack of splintering wood. Both teenagers froze. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. Marcus was already moving, checking each joint and support beam with practiced efficiency. He found the problem near the shelter's northern wall. One of the primary support posts had developed a hairline fracture. It wasn't critical yet, but under this sustained stress, it could propagate quickly. "We need to reinforce it," he said, grabbing tools from his carefully organized supply kit. "Hold this steady." As they worked together, Sarah's hands sure and strong as she helped him position a splint, Marcus realized something had changed. For the first time since his father's death, he wasn't facing a crisis alone. The knowledge should have made him feel vulnerable, dependent. Instead, it felt like strength multiplied. "There," he said, as they secured the final brace. The repair would hold, buying them time. Sarah sat back on her heels, breathing hard from the exertion. "So, are we going to build that rescue pod?" Outside, the storm continued its assault with undiminished fury. Somewhere in that white hell, people were struggling to survive, counting down hours or maybe minutes before the cold claimed them. Marcus looked at his notebook, at the sketches that could save lives or kill them both. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we are." The snowmobile's engine cut through the morning silence like a chainsaw through silk. Kai pressed himself against the shelter's wall, peering through the camouflaged observation slot he'd built into the structure's northeast corner. 3 figures in military-grade winter gear dismounted from their vehicles, their movements precise and coordinated. Marcus Volkov stepped forward, removing his helmet to reveal the same cold eyes that had haunted Kai's nightmares for 2 years. Even from this distance, Kai could see the jagged scar running from his left ear to his jaw, a souvenir from their last encounter in the Siberian research facility. Spread out, Volkov's voice carried clearly across the frozen landscape. "The thermal readings show heat signatures from this direction. Our little engineer is close." Kai's blood turned to ice water. Thermal readings. Of course they'd have military-grade equipment. His shelter's innovative design had fooled park rangers and impressed experts, but it wasn't invisible to infrared technology. The carefully layered insulation that kept him warm was also broadcasting his location like a beacon. He watched as Volkov's men began methodically searching the area, their movements forming an expanding grid pattern. Professional, thorough, deadly. Moving silently through his shelter's interior, Kai activated the emergency protocols he'd hoped never to use. His fingers found the hidden panel containing the flash drives, exact copies of the research data that had started this nightmare. The information that proved Volkov's illegal weapons development program, the evidence that had cost his father his life. Through another observation port, he spotted Sarah's cabin in the distance. Smoke rose from her chimney, oblivious to the danger approaching. She'd be starting her morning routine, probably making coffee and checking on her equipment. The thought of these men finding her sent panic shooting through his chest. Kai sealed the drives in a waterproof container and secured them inside his jacket. Then he accessed the shelter's most ingenious feature, one he'd never mentioned to anyone. His fingers found the concealed lever beneath the main support beam, and he pulled. The shelter's roof began to telescope downward while the walls shifted outward, transforming the living space into something resembling a natural snowdrift. Emergency vents ensured airflow, while the structure's external appearance changed completely. To casual observation, it would look like just another wind-carved mound of snow. But thermal scanners would still detect him. Volkov's voice grew closer. Kai Nakamura, I know you're here. Your amateur hour is over, boy. You've played an impressive game, but games end. Through the modified viewing slot, Kai saw Volkov standing 50 meters away, scanning the terrain with professional patience. The man looked older, but no less dangerous. If anything, the scar had made him more intimidating. Your father thought he could hide his research from us, Volkov continued, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. He learned otherwise. You're carrying something that belongs to my organization, and I'm here to collect it. Kai's jaw clenched. His father had died protecting this information, evidence of biological weapons testing that violated every international treaty. The drives contained proof of human experimentation, illegal arms sales, and worse. Getting this evidence to the right authorities was the only way to honor his father's sacrifice. One of Volkov's men approached with a tablet displaying thermal readings. They exchanged words too quiet for Kai to hear, but their body language spoke volumes. They were triangulating his position. Time was running out. Kai activated the shelter's final defense mechanism, a feature inspired by his study of Arctic animal behavior. Hidden heating elements began warming false chambers throughout the structure while redirecting his actual body heat through an intricate ventilation system. The thermal signature would scatter, making his exact location unclear. It might buy him minutes, but not much more. He checked his emergency pack, the drives, survival gear, and his father's encrypted satellite phone, his only connection to Agent Chen, the FBI contact who'd been helping him from the shadows. But using the phone would reveal his position instantly. Through the scope of his handmade slingshot, Kai spotted movement near Sarah's cabin. One of Volkov's men was approaching her front door. The sight triggered something primal in Kai's chest, a protective instinct that overrode his survival training. Sarah had shown him kindness when the world seemed determined to destroy him. She'd treated him like family without asking questions about his past. Now she was in danger because of him. Volkov's voice cut through his thoughts. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, boy. Show yourself now, and the ranger woman lives. Make me search for you, and things get complicated. The threat hung in the crystalline air like a death sentence. Kai pressed his forehead against the cold metal of his shelter's frame, wrestling with an impossible choice. Surrender meant death, but resistance meant Sarah's blood on his hands. In the distance, he heard Sarah's door creak open. The storm had been raging for 3 days when Marcus noticed the smoke. He pressed his face against the reinforced observation window he'd built into the shelter's north wall, squinting through the swirling snow. There, a thin grey tendril rising from behind the ridge where the old logging road curved out of sight. Too steady to be natural, too controlled to be an accident. His blood turned to ice water. Sarah was checking the temperature gauges near the central heating core, oblivious to his discovery. Still dropping, she called out. -43 and falling. Thank God for your crazy underground design. Marcus stepped back from the window, his mind racing. The smoke could mean anything. Another stranded traveler, park rangers conducting a search, even firefighters using the old warming huts. But after 11 years of running, he knew better than to hope for innocent explanations. Sarah, his voice came out steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. I need to check the emergency supplies. She looked up from the gauges, noting something in his tone. Everything okay? Being thorough. He moved to the storage compartments he'd built into the shelter's walls, his fingers automatically finding the hidden catch he'd installed behind the food stores. The secret panel swung open, revealing items Sarah had never seen: a prepaid satellite phone, emergency cash, and his father's final letter, still in its blood-stained envelope. The satellite phone had been his insurance policy, something he'd sworn never to use unless absolutely necessary. He powered it on with trembling fingers, watching the signal bars struggle to find a connection through the storm. Marcus, you're scaring me. Sarah had moved closer, her voice tight with concern. What's going on? Before he could answer, the phone buzzed with an incoming message. Unknown number, but Marcus recognized the format immediately. The same coded structure his father had taught him years ago. The hawk flies at dawn. Nest compromised. Time to roost. The words hit him like a physical blow. After all these years, Vincent Kozlov had found him. Sarah was reading over his shoulder now, her face pale. "Marcus, what does that mean? Who sent this?" He deleted the message with mechanical precision, his survival training overriding the terror threatening to freeze his thoughts. "We need to prepare for visitors." What kind of visitors? The kind that don't knock. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, but Marcus could barely hear it over the pounding of his heart. He moved to another hidden panel, this one containing items he'd hoped never to touch, weapons his father had taught him to use, emergency rations designed for extended flight, and detailed maps of escape routes through the wilderness. "Jesus Christ, Marcus!" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Who are you?" He turned to face her. Seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes, for 3 weeks he'd allowed himself to pretend he could have a normal life, that maybe the running was over. But normality was a luxury he'd never been allowed to keep. "My real name is Marcus Petrov," he said quietly. "My father was Alexei Petrov. 5 years ago he stole something from a very dangerous man named Vincent Kozlov, something worth killing for." Sarah sank onto one of the shelter's built-in benches, her face draining of color. "Stole what?" "Information. Financial records, murder contracts, enough evidence to destroy Kozlov's entire operation." Marcus continued his methodical inventory of escape supplies. Dad was Kozlov's accountant until he discovered what the money was really for. When he tried to turn state's evidence, they killed him. But not before he hid the files and taught me how to disappear. The implications crashed over Sarah like a wave, and you've been running ever since. 11 years. Different names, different towns, always moving. He sealed the emergency pack and slung it over his shoulder. "I thought maybe the cold would stop them, that even Kozlov wouldn't risk coming into this storm. I was wrong." Sarah stood abruptly, her jaw set with determination. "What do we do?" "We?" Marcus stared at her. "Sarah, you need to understand, these people don't leave witnesses. If they find you with me—" Marcus wanted to believe her optimism, but he'd learned long ago that hope was a dangerous luxury. The smoke means they're already closer than we thought, and the storm won't last forever. Through the observation window, he caught another glimpse of the distant smoke, stronger now despite the wind. Kozlov's people were moving, getting closer with each passing hour. The shelter that had protected them from the killing cold would soon become their trap. Time was running out, and the temperature wasn't the only thing dropping toward fatal levels. The storm hit like a living thing, clawing at the shelter with winds that screamed through the trees at 90 miles per hour. Marcus pressed himself against the inner wall, feeling the entire structure flex and bend but never break. The engineering he'd built into every joint, every support beam, was holding against nature's fury. Sarah huddled beside him, her face pale in the dim light of the emergency lantern. "How long can this last?" she shouted over the howling wind. "The weather service said 12 hours minimum," Marcus replied, checking his watch. They were only 3 hours in. "But the shelter will hold. It has to." Outside, the temperature had dropped to 47 below zero, with wind chills pushing it past 60 below. No human could survive more than minutes in those conditions. The shelter's multi-layered insulation system was working perfectly, maintaining a steady 68 degrees inside, while hell froze over just beyond the walls. Dr. Chen sat in the corner, frantically typing on her satellite phone. "I've got partial signal," she announced. "Marcus, I need to tell you something. My research team found more information about Dmitry Volkov." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water. "What kind of information?" "He's not just a survivalist extremist. He's former Spetsnaz, Russian Special Forces, and he's been tracking survival prodigies across 3 countries, trying to recruit them for something called Project Arctic Wolf. Kids who refuse to cooperate." She swallowed hard. "They disappear." The shelter shuddered as a massive tree branch struck the roof. Marcus automatically checked the stress points he'd reinforced, but his mind was racing. Everything was connecting. The careful questions from strangers at survival competitions, the feeling of being watched, the way his foster parents had died so conveniently in that car accident. "How many kids?" he asked quietly. 7 confirmed missing, all between 14 and 18, all with exceptional wilderness skills. Dr. Chen's voice was grim. "Marcus, I think you were supposed to be number 8. Sarah grabbed his arm. "That's why you built this place. You knew someone was coming." Marcus nodded slowly. "I felt them getting closer for months. This storm isn't just cover for us, it's a trap. Volkov's team would expect me to hunker down somewhere conventional, somewhere they could breach. But this shelter," he gestured at the innovative design around them. "This is something they've never encountered. A new sound cut through the wind, mechanical, rhythmic. Helicopter rotors." "That's impossible," Dr. Chen breathed. "No aircraft can fly in these conditions." Marcus was already moving, grabbing his emergency pack and checking the hidden weapons cache he'd built into the wall. "Russian aircraft are built different. They can handle extreme weather better than anything we have." The rotor sound grew closer, then suddenly stopped. Marcus felt his heart hammering as he realized they'd landed somewhere nearby. In this storm, that took either incredible skill or desperate determination. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "There's an emergency exit through the floor that leads to the underground tunnel system. Sarah, take Dr. Chen and follow the red markers. They'll lead you to the secondary shelter about half a mile east." "What about you?" Sarah's eyes were wide with fear. "I'm staying. This shelter isn't just a hiding place, it's a fortress. Every system, every design element I built into it can be weaponized if necessary." Marcus pulled out a device that looked like a modified smartphone. "The heating system can be reversed to create instant flash freezing in the entrance tunnel. The support beams can be collapsed in sequence to create barriers. Even the solar collection panels can be angled to create blinding light reflection." Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow outside, barely audible over the wind. Marcus counted at least 4 sets of boots moving with military precision. "They're here," he whispered. Dr. Chen was already opening the hidden floor panel. "Marcus, you don't have to face this alone. Come with us. If I run now, they'll never stop hunting. And next time, other people might get hurt." Marcus checked the shelter's defense systems one final time. "Besides, I've spent 2 years preparing for this moment. Every calculation, every contingency plan, it all leads to tonight." A metallic tapping echoed from the main entrance. Someone was testing the door structure, looking for weaknesses they wouldn't find. "Go," Marcus urged. "I'll hold them off and meet you at the secondary shelter when this is over." Sarah hesitated at the tunnel entrance. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise I'll be smart," Marcus replied. "There's a difference." The storm hit with the fury of a living thing, transforming the forest into a howling nightmare of ice and wind. Marcus pressed himself against the shelter's inner wall, listening to the structure groan and flex around him. Snow pelted the exterior like machine gun fire, but the walls held firm. His impossible design was proving itself in the crucible of nature's wrath. Through the small observation window he'd carved near the entrance, Marcus could barely make out shapes moving in the white chaos outside. 3 figures stumbled through the blizzard, their flashlight beams cutting weak swaths through the driving snow. Even through the storm's roar, he could hear Victor's voice barking orders in Russian. They'd found him. Despite the storm, despite his precautions, despite everything he'd built to stay hidden. Marcus felt his chest tighten as memories flooded back. His father's research facility, the explosion, the desperate flight that had brought him to these woods months ago. The shelter's thermal regulation system worked flawlessly, maintaining a steady temperature even as the wind outside reached deadly speeds. Marcus had designed it using principles that shouldn't have worked according to conventional wisdom, but survival had taught him that conventional wisdom often meant death. He'd layered insulation in geometric patterns that created air pockets within air pockets, each one trapping warmth while allowing just enough circulation to prevent condensation. One of the figures outside stopped directly in front of his shelter. Marcus held his breath, knowing that even the smallest sound could give him away. The person, he couldn't tell if it was Victor or one of his men, seemed to be studying the structure. In the darkness and swirling snow, the shelter looked like nothing more than a natural formation, a quirk of fallen trees and accumulated debris. But Victor was smart, patient. He'd been hunting Marcus for months, following every lead, tracking every mistake. The man who'd destroyed his father's life wouldn't give up easily. The figure moved on, and Marcus allowed himself a silent exhale. He'd positioned emergency supplies near the rear exit, a narrow tunnel that emerged 50 yards away, concealed beneath a fallen log. If they discovered the main entrance, he could slip out the back and disappear into the storm. It would be dangerous, possibly fatal, but staying put if they found him would be certain death. A sharp crack echoed through the shelter as something heavy struck the exterior wall. Marcus froze, every muscle tense. Another impact, then another. They weren't random. Someone was probing the structure, testing its stability. The methodical nature of the sounds told Marcus everything he needed to know. Victor had found something suspicious. Through the window, Marcus saw a flashlight beam sweep across the shelter's entrance. The beam paused, moved away, then snapped back. Even camouflaged as it was, something about the opening had caught the searcher's attention. Marcus grabbed his emergency pack and crawled toward the rear tunnel. His movements were precise, silent, honed by months of practice. Every item in the shelter had been positioned for exactly this scenario. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a carefully constructed false wall that looked like solid earth and roots. As he prepared to slip into the tunnel, voices became audible over the storm. Victor was shouting something about heat signatures, about thermal imaging equipment back at their vehicle. Marcus's blood went cold. The shelter's efficient heat retention, the very feature that kept him alive, would show up like a beacon on thermal imaging. He had minutes at most. The tunnel was barely wider than his shoulders, its walls lined with the same insulation techniques he'd used throughout the shelter. It had taken him weeks to dig, working only at night, disposing of the soil gradually to avoid detection. Now it might be the difference between escape and capture. Halfway through the tunnel, Marcus heard voices at the shelter's main entrance. They'd found it. Victor's distinctive accent carried clearly as he ordered his men to surround the structure. The note of triumph in his voice made Marcus's jaw clench with anger and fear. He emerged from the tunnel into the full fury of the blizzard. The wind hit him like a physical blow, instantly coating his face with ice. Visibility was nearly zero, but that worked in his favor now. The same storm that had driven Victor's men to seek shelter was now his ally. Marcus oriented himself using techniques his father had taught him years ago, before everything went wrong. The GPS in his pack was useless in these conditions, but he knew these woods intimately. Every tree, every rock formation, every game trail was mapped in his memory. Behind him, flashlight beams pierced the darkness around his shelter. They'd be inside soon, finding it empty but warm, realizing their prey had slipped away. Victor would be furious, but he'd also be impressed. The man appreciated skill, even in his enemies. The storm raged harder, temperature plummeting to levels that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. But Marcus wasn't unprepared. He never was. Somewhere in this frozen wilderness, he'd build another shelter, create another sanctuary. The hunt would continue, but tonight, survival was victory enough. The blizzard had transformed the world into a white void. But inside the shelter's heart, Marcus felt the walls closing in for an entirely different reason. The radio crackled with static as he tried desperately to reach Elena, but only fragments of her voice broke through the storm's interference. "Marcus, can you—" "Position compromised." His blood ran cold. Position compromised. Those weren't words Elena would use lightly. Someone had found her, which meant they were closer than he'd ever imagined possible. His fingers flew across the emergency frequencies, searching for any clear signal, but the storm was devouring everything. Through the observation window carved into his shelter's upper level, he watched the snow fall in sheets so thick he couldn't see beyond 10 feet. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the carefully balanced structure he'd spent months perfecting. Under normal circumstances, he'd be proud that his creation was holding against nature's assault. Tonight it felt like a tomb. A metallic scraping sound cut through the wind's roar. Marcus froze, every nerve firing at once. That wasn't the storm. That wasn't settling snow or shifting ice. That was deliberate, purposeful, the sound of someone probing his outer defenses. He moved with practiced silence through the shelter's maze-like interior, grateful now for every seemingly paranoid detail he'd built into the design. The redundant escape routes, the false walls, the weapons caches hidden throughout. Elena had called them excessive. She'd been wrong. Another scrape, closer now. Then voices, muffled by the storm but unmistakably human. His worst nightmare was unfolding in the middle of nature's own apocalypse. "Thermal readings are scattered," came a voice from somewhere near the shelter's eastern wall. "Could be heat reflection from all this metal he's used. Keep scanning. Kid's in there somewhere. Storm won't last forever." Marcus's breath caught. They knew. After 3 years of running, of building new identities and disappearing into wilderness areas where normal people feared to tread, they'd finally found him. But how? The storm should have made thermal tracking impossible, and he'd designed the shelter specifically to disperse heat signatures, unless they'd been watching longer than he realized. He slipped down to the lower level where his emergency gear waited. The go-bag he'd hoped never to use again sat exactly where he'd left it, containing everything needed for another disappearance. New identity papers, cash, survival essentials. But looking at it now, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the desire to stop running. This shelter represented more than survival architecture. It was proof that he could create instead of just react, that he could build something meaningful rather than simply endure. In the past week, helping Dr. Reeves and the stranded families, he'd tasted what normal life might feel like. The thought of abandoning it all again made his chest tight with unexpected grief. A soft thud from above jerked him back to reality. They were on the roof. Moving quickly but quietly, he activated the shelter's defensive systems, measures he'd installed but prayed he'd never need. Pressure sensors armed. Secondary heating elements engaged to create false heat signatures throughout the structure. Emergency beacon disabled to prevent tracking. The radio suddenly burst to life with Elena's voice, clearer now. "Marcus, listen carefully. They found me, but I got away. Storm's breaking up their coordination. You have maybe 20 minutes before they regroup and bring serious equipment." 20 minutes. He could be gone in 5, vanished into the storm using the exit tunnel that emerged a quarter-mile away. By the time they breached the shelter, he'd be just another set of tracks being erased by falling snow. But Dr. Reeves was still out there with hypothermia. The Henderson family was trapped in their cabin with a newborn. The warming station he'd helped establish was the only thing keeping a dozen people alive tonight. If he ran now, if he triggered the shelter's final defensive measure, the resulting explosion would take out the communications array and heating distribution system he'd jury-rigged to serve the entire area. People would die. The footsteps above grew more systematic, searching. They were mapping the structure, looking for access points. Professional, patient, thorough. Exactly what he'd expected and feared. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years' worth of survival instincts, warring against something newer and more fragile. The bonds he'd accidentally formed with this community. Elena had taught him to run, to prioritize survival above all else. But she'd also taught him that some things were worth the risk. His hand moved away from the go-bag and toward the weapons cache instead. For the first time since he was 13 years old, Marcus chose to stand and fight. The storm raged on, but inside the shelter's depths, a different kind of tempest was building. They'd come expecting to corner a frightened boy. They were about to discover they'd found a survivor who'd finally found something worth protecting. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the wind's relentless assault on the shelter walls. Marcus kept his rifle trained on Victor, while Elena pressed herself against the far wall, her face pale in the flickering candlelight. The storm outside seemed to sense the tension within, howling with renewed fury. Victor's laugh was cold, brittle. "You think that toy will stop me, boy? After everything I've survived?" "It stopped your men," Marcus replied, his voice steadier than his hands. The weight of the rifle felt both foreign and familiar, like a half-remembered nightmare. "My men were expendable. I am not." Victor took a slow step forward, testing Marcus's resolve. "You've led me quite the chase, I'll give you that. But this ends tonight." Elena found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Who is he, Marcus? What does he want?" Marcus's eyes never left Victor's face. "Tell her," he said. "Tell her who you really are." Victor's smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow from years of cigarettes and neglect. "I'm family, dear girl. Marcus's uncle, though he seems to have forgotten his manners." "Step-uncle," Marcus corrected sharply. "And you stopped being family the day you killed my mother." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elena's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the storm. Victor's expression shifted, the predatory grin replaced by something darker. "Your mother died in an accident," Victor said, his accent thickening with emotion. "Car went off the road in a snowstorm, just like this one. Tragic, really. After you tampered with her brakes." Marcus's finger moved closer to the trigger. "After she found out about your business, about what you were smuggling through her shipping company." Victor shrugged, a gesture that somehow made him seem more dangerous, not less. She was going to ruin everything. 20 years I spent building my network, and she was going to destroy it all for what? Principles? He spat the word like a curse. The shelter creaked ominously as a particularly strong gust hit it. Snow found its way through microscopic gaps, dusting the floor like powdered glass. Marcus felt the cold seeping through his clothes, but adrenaline kept him focused. "The authorities cleared me of any wrongdoing," Victor continued conversationally. "And they would have left you alone too if you hadn't started digging, asking questions, following paper trails." His eyes glittered in the candlelight. "You always were too clever for your own good." Elena edged closer to Marcus, her hand finding his free arm. "That's why you disappeared," she whispered. "Why you've been hiding." "He's been preparing," Victor corrected, "building his little fortress, thinking he could outlast me. But I'm patient, boy. Patient and persistent. It took me 2 years to track you down, but here we are." Marcus felt his arms beginning to shake from holding the rifle steady. The weapon was heavier than he'd anticipated, and the cold was making his muscles stiff. Victor noticed, his smile returning. "You won't shoot me," Victor said confidently. "You're not a killer, not like your uncle." "You're not my uncle," Marcus said through gritted teeth. Semantics. Victor took another step forward. "I raised you after she died, fed you, clothed you, gave you everything a boy could want. You kept me as insurance, in case anyone started investigating my mother's death. Smart boy, but not smart enough." Victor's hand moved toward his coat pocket. "You see, I've realized something during this little adventure. You'll never stop running, never stop looking for evidence, never stop being a threat." The motion was swift and practiced. Victor's hand emerged from his pocket holding a knife, its blade catching the candlelight as he lunged forward. Marcus pulled the trigger without thinking, the rifle's roar deafening in the confined space. The recoil knocked him backward into Elena, and they both crashed to the ground. Victor stumbled but didn't fall. Dark blood spread across his left shoulder, but he still held the knife. His face was a mask of rage and pain. "Lucky shot," he snarled, advancing again. Marcus tried to work the rifle's bolt action, but his hands were shaking too badly. The mechanism jammed, and Victor was almost on top of them. Elena screamed and rolled away as the knife descended. Then the shelter shuddered violently, and a new sound joined the storm's symphony, a deep, grinding rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Victor paused, confusion replacing rage on his bloodied face. The avalanche that Marcus had been monitoring for days had finally broken free from the mountainside above. Tons of snow and ice were thundering toward the valley, and their shelters sat directly in its path. "Move!" Marcus shouted, abandoning the rifle and grabbing Elena's hand. Outside, the world was ending in white. The storm had passed, but Marcus knew the real tempest was just beginning. Through the reinforced viewing panel he'd carved into his shelter's wall, he watched 3 figures emerge from the tree line like specters materializing from the white void. Even at this distance, he recognized Victor's distinctive gait, measured, predatory, confident. The man who had turned his life into a nightmare had finally found him. "Impossible," Marcus whispered, his breath fogging the thick ice that served as his window. His shelter had been built in the most remote location he could find, hidden beneath layers of snow and ingeniously camouflaged. Yet here they were. His mind raced through the possibilities. The emergency beacon Dr. Sarah Chen had activated 3 days ago. It had to be. The rescue attempt that had saved her life had also betrayed his location. The irony wasn't lost on him. His first genuine act of trust in 2 years had sealed his fate. Victor stopped 50 yards from the shelter's concealed entrance, scanning the seemingly empty landscape. Even now, Marcus had to admire the man's persistence. 2 years of running, of constantly looking over his shoulder, and Victor had never stopped hunting. The flash drives Marcus had stolen contained enough evidence to destroy Victor's human trafficking operation, but only if Marcus lived long enough to deliver them to the right people. The other 2 men, muscle by their look, began a systematic search pattern. Victor pulled out what looked like a tablet, probably running thermal imaging. Marcus's shelter design had accounted for this possibility. The multiple air chambers and ingenious ventilation system dispersed his heat signature across a wide area, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint his exact location. But they would find him eventually. They always did. Marcus moved away from the viewing panel and began his preparations. Every survival instinct Dr. Reeves had drilled into him over years of training kicked in. This wasn't about winter survival anymore. This was about staying alive long enough to see another spring. He pulled on his heaviest gear, strapped his emergency pack to his back, and checked the modified flare gun he'd kept hidden since fleeing Chicago. 3 shots. Not much against 3 armed men, but it would have to do. The flash drives went into the waterproof pouch around his neck, his insurance policy and his burden. A metallic scraping sound echoed through the shelter's walls. They'd found the primary entrance. Marcus smiled grimly, let them try to break through. His reinforced door design could withstand a direct assault for at least 20 minutes. But he hadn't spent months building this shelter with only one way out. Moving to the rear wall, Marcus pressed against a seemingly solid section of packed snow and ice. The hidden panel swung inward, revealing a tunnel he'd excavated during the long dark nights when sleep wouldn't come. It connected to a secondary chamber 50 yards away, positioned to give him multiple escape routes. The sound of drilling reached him as he crawled through the narrow passage. Victor's team had come prepared with power tools. Marcus's 20-minute estimate dropped to 10, maybe less. He emerged from the tunnel into the smaller secondary shelter, quickly gathering the supplies he'd cached there, rope, ice axes, and the compact radio he'd been saving for emergencies. If he could reach higher ground, maybe he could call for help. The ranger station was still monitoring emergency frequencies. Through the camouflaged entrance of the secondary shelter, Marcus could see Victor's men working frantically at his main structure. The sound of their drilling had taken on a different pitch. They were almost through. Moving like a ghost through the snow, Marcus began his ascent toward the rocky outcrop that overlooked his hidden valley. Each step had to be perfect. One sound, one careless movement, and his advantage would disappear. Behind him, he heard the crash of his shelter door giving way, followed by shouts of surprise. His main shelter appeared empty, but Victor was too smart to assume he'd vanished. They would find the tunnel entrance within minutes. Halfway up the slope, Marcus's foot broke through a hidden snowdrift. He plunged waist-deep, the sudden movement sending a cascade of loose snow down the hillside. He froze, listening. Had they heard? Victor's voice carried across the cold air, sharp with command. "Spread out. Check for secondary exits. He's still here." Marcus pulled himself free and continued climbing, his heart hammering against his ribs. The radio crackled to life in his hands as he reached better elevation. He adjusted the frequency to the emergency channel and whispered into the device. "This is Marcus Webb. I'm at coordinates." He rattled off his GPS position from memory. "3 armed men are hunting me. They're connected to human trafficking operations in Chicago. If anyone receives this transmission, please contact federal authorities." A response crackled through the static. "Marcus, this is Ranger Station 7. We copy your location. Help is en route." Below him, flashlight beams swept through the darkness like searching fingers. Victor had found his trail. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the first rays of sunlight Jake had seen in days. He stood at the entrance of his shelter, breathing in air so cold it made his lungs ache, but for the first time in weeks, he felt something approaching peace. Marcus lay unconscious on the thermal bed Jake had constructed, his breathing steady and strong. The man who had hunted him across 3 states, who had destroyed his family, now depended entirely on Jake's mercy and skill. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jake checked the radio one more time, adjusting the frequency dial with numb fingers. Static filled the air, then suddenly, voices. "Search Team 7, this is base camp. Any sign of survivors in Sector 4? Jake's heart hammered as he grabbed the transmitter. "Base camp, this is Jake Chen. I have an injured man who needs immediate medical attention. We're approximately 2 miles northeast of Cedar Ridge in a reinforced shelter." The response came quickly. "Jake Chen? Son, we've been looking for you for days. Your aunt in Seattle contacted authorities when you went missing. Can you give us your exact coordinates?" For a moment, Jake hesitated. Once he revealed his location, everything would change. The careful isolation he'd maintained, the hard-won survival skills that had kept him alive, all of it would end. But as he looked at Marcus, whose lips were still tinged blue despite the shelter's warmth, he knew he had no choice. He provided the coordinates, then added, "The injured man. His name is Marcus Volkov. He's wanted by federal authorities. You'll want to send more than just paramedics." As Jake waited for the rescue team, he began dismantling the more sensitive components of his shelter, the hidden compartments where he'd stored his father's research notes, the sophisticated water filtration system that incorporated technology years ahead of anything commercially available. These secrets would remain buried in the wilderness. He'd kept his father's legacy safe, just as he'd promised. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the thin mountain air announced their arrival. Jake stepped outside, waving his arms above his head as the aircraft circled overhead, its downdraft sending snow spiraling in violent eddies around the shelter. 3 figures rappelled down, 2 paramedics and a federal agent, whose stern expression softened when he saw Jake standing alone in the vast white wilderness. "You're just a kid," the agent said, his voice filled with amazement. "How did you survive out here?" Jake gestured toward his shelter. "I built something that worked." While the paramedics worked on Marcus, stabilizing him for transport, the federal agent questioned Jake about his ordeal. Jake told most of the truth, how Marcus had pursued him, how the storm had trapped them both, how he'd made the choice to save the man who'd tried to kill him. He omitted certain details, the true nature of his father's work, the revolutionary technologies hidden in his shelter's design, the fact that he'd known this confrontation was inevitable since the day his parents died. "You did good, son," the agent said as they loaded Marcus onto a stretcher. "What you built here, it's remarkable. Our engineering team is going to want to study this shelter." "I'm sure they will," Jake replied, knowing they'd find only conventional survival techniques and standard materials. The real innovations were already erased. As the helicopter lifted off with Marcus inside, a ground team arrived with snowmobiles and cold weather gear. Jake took one last look at his shelter, the fortress of ice and ingenuity that had saved both their lives. The ride down the mountain was surreal. After weeks of silence broken only by wind and crackling fire, the roar of the snowmobile engine seemed impossibly loud. The wilderness that had been his whole world for so long fell away behind them, replaced gradually by the geometric patterns of civilization, power lines, roads, buildings. At the base station, Jake called his Aunt Sarah. Her voice broke when she heard him, relief and worry mingling in words that tumbled over each other. She'd been terrified, she said. She'd mobilized search teams, contacted every agency she could think of, refused to believe he was lost forever. "I'm okay," Jake told her, and for the first time in years, it felt true. Later, alone in a warm motel room with clean sheets and running water, Jake stared out at the snow-covered landscape. Marcus would face justice for his crimes. The research that had cost his parents their lives was finally truly safe, and Jake himself was no longer running. He picked up his phone and scrolled through messages from classmates who'd heard about his ordeal. Normal teenage concerns, homework, dating, college applications, that seemed both trivial and precious after his weeks in the wilderness. Tomorrow, he'd fly home to Seattle. He'd return to high school, maybe even try out for the engineering club. He'd live the ordinary life his parents had died to give him. But he'd never forget the lessons the mountain had taught him, or the shelter that had saved not just his life but his soul.